Okay, good afternoon, everyone. It's good to be with you again for another session today. And as we begin, we want to continue where we left off last week, looking at the second beast of Revelation, chapter 13. So let's just bow our heads of prayer and we get straight into our session today. Heavenly Father, we thank you for your blessings. We thank you for all that you continue to reveal to us and for guiding us through our many lessons and our many sessions and for helping us understand your word. As we go through today, dear Lord, we ask for your special guidance that you will reveal your will. Help me to present the message as you have expected it to be presented in your study and in the Bible. And may we understand the truths that you have in store for us in your words, that we can be drawn closer to you is our prayer in Jesus' most holy name. Amen. All right, so let's get going. We have, as always, a lot to cover, so let's just head to our screen and get going. Thanks again for everyone joining us, and pleasant Sabbath to all. All right, so let's get going. Last week we began this session on the second beast of Revelation. That's why we call it part 2. And this week is really continuing, so I'm really putting both dates there. So today, as we begin this second part of Revelation, or the second part of Revelation chapter 13, I won't do too much of a review because we've been doing a lot of that last week and we spent a lot of time reviewing. So we'll just talk quickly about where this whole chapter fits into the book. And then we get into the outline of Revelation chapter 13. We review our conclusions on the first beast, which is the one that came out of the sea. And then we move into the second beast and we will spend some time talking around its identity and its activities, which is what we started last week. I want to do a refresher around Daniel chapter 3, which we studied last year, 2020. I think we covered Daniel chapter 3 in May last year, or April maybe. And I want to talk about that because it has some significance for the rest of chapter 13. So today, when we are finished, we would have covered verses 11 to 13, which is just about 3 verses. But we will want to move next week into the image of the beast and then the mark of the beast. If we can cover both together, we will, but I don't think we will. It's just a lot to cover. And I know some of you are anxious to get to mark of the beast and you have your thoughts around that and maybe your own understanding. And that's fine because we want to explore all those things and just make sure if you know it already, we reinforce what we know. If you are coming to have a better understanding, at least we'll be able to make the connection to all that we've studied so far. All right. So that's kind of the approach that we are taking going forward as the approach we have taken before. So let's move quickly into the outline of the book of Revelation. And the thing is, I just want you to appreciate, if you will, that I want to call in. I was thinking about this week, and I was thinking that I want to call this section, if you will, the nucleus of the book. So if I were to just draw, well, I don't know if I can, yeah, just draw. Nah, I can't seem to get that going, but that's the next story. Right, but let's forget that, yeah. So what I'm saying is, I think you can see my pointer. And basically what I'm saying is that this section here is the nucleus of the book, right? So that if we understand what is happening in Revelation 12 to 14 to a large extent, it gives us a very good preparation for the rest of the book. So we're not guessing what we are picking up in the rest of the book because it's aligned to what we are studying in the nucleus here. And it really points to what the beginning of the book was heading to, right? So you may find that I'm taking a while to sort of push through on these chapters, and that is deliberate because I think it's so important to appreciate what we are studying at this point in time, which is really the key section of the book that joins the historical half with the eschatological half, which is the future half of the book that deals with the second coming of Jesus Christ in a much more profound and deliberate way. All right, so that was just a quick one slide. And then as we get to chapter 13, we remember that we are dealing with basically we've made three categories, if you will, three subsections. We talked about the first beast that came out of the sea. And by the way, as always, if you have any questions, feel free to hit me up. But to use the young people to hit me up on the Q&A, on the Zoom, and on the chat as well. And then you can also use your chat in the YouTube channel as well. All right. So we have looked at the first beast, which came out of the sea, which we said really is Rome, and it is a religious political Rome. The little horn Rome that we saw in Daniel is the same Rome we have been looking at in here. But we seem to be going beyond just 1798, when Rome would have experienced its greatest defeat, if you will, by secularism and the French Revolution. And it seems to be projecting life beyond that. As a matter of fact, we talk here about the wound being healed, the wound of the beast. If the beast is the Roman Empire led by the Roman Church, the Roman Catholic Church, and its leadership, and the way that they leveraged, if you will, political power in the management of Europe and in the world in particular, then what we are basically suggesting is that this is really about how the wound will be healed later on. So we'll come back to that. And now we are into the second beast, which is one that is coming up from the earth, and that is deliberately contrasted to the one that came up from the sea. So that the fact that it's come up from the earth is extremely important, and we want to talk about its identity as well as its activities. And then when we get, so that's where we are today in looking at verses 12 to 13, but I'll pick up verse 11 as well, and we tie all of that in together. And then we want to talk about the image of the beast, which is really the rest of the chapter. And in that, we will encounter the mark of the beast as well. All right. So we want to understand that while the chapter has clearly presented us with two beasts, plural, you notice that when we get to the last verses, it's talking about the image of the beast, singular, which kind of suggests that one of these two beasts takes prominence over the other. And we'll maybe try to understand that. And there's a serious interplay, if you will, between the first and the second beast. And the interplay seems to suggest, I can let that cat out of the bag now. The interplay seems to suggest that the second beast, in some way or the other, facilitates the role of the first beast beyond 1798. So that up until 1798, the first beast is the Roman Church in its religious political form, exercising authority as a state and as a government agency in addition to religious power. And that mix is considered to be, that cocktail of church and state coming together is considered to be very potent and very dangerous to the believers who are not aligned to what the church teaches, because they are persecuted and they are thrown into the wilderness and they are hiding and stuff from the beast, etc. And all of that is taking place against the backdrop of Revelation chapter 12, which gave us a very full appreciation of the great controversy that talked about the fact that the dragon, who is Lucifer, the devil first attempted to destroy Christ, the child of the woman of the church, when he came upon the earth. And then when he failed and he was upset about that, he then went after the woman. But the woman fled into the wilderness, and she was saved, if you will, by the earth. All right? A same kind of earth features in the second beast. And having been saved by the earth, it looks as if the dragon is now extremely wrought that he has failed to really devour the woman during this period. And he attempts to go after her again after that, going into the earth period, into the wilderness period. He goes after her again. And this time he goes after the remnant of her seed. They are classified as people who keep God's commandments and who have the gift of prophecy, which is we call the testimony of Jesus. All right, so that is kind of important for us. This is the three divisions that we are focusing on as we go forward. I think we all remember that. When we looked at the first beast, we made some conclusions, all right? We said that the beast represents an earthly kingdom as was represented in Daniel. So just as how Daniel had used beasts, lion, bear, leopard with four heads, and then a fourth beast defying description to represent Rome. In much the same way, when Revelation, John uses beast in Revelation chapter 13, he is referencing a kingdom on earth. And this is a metaphorical representation of the kingdom of earth by calling it a beast. Remember that the first beast, he sees its dragon nature, but then he also sees that it has the form of a leopard, the form of a bear, and then the form of a lion, all right? Almost in reverse, if you will, to the way Daniel saw it when he saw a lion, and then he saw a bear, and then he saw a leopard, and then he saw a beast that defied description. You could call it a dragon. And some may ask, well, why is that different in Revelation to Daniel? And we said very clearly that in Daniel, Daniel was living in the time of the lion. So that is a representation that takes prominence, Babylon. And John, on the other hand, is living in the time of the Romans. So Rome as a beast that defies description, a dragon-like beast, is what takes prominence. And he looks back to its origins, while in Daniel, he was looking forward to the nations that will come after Babylon. Everybody okay with that? We then said that rising from the sea has special implications, because later on in Revelation chapter 17 and indeed 19, we will encounter where very clearly the prophet says that the waters represented people. All right. And we have seen that as well in the Old Testament language, where sometimes in the prophecies of Ezekiel, the people in strife were seen as stormy waters and stormy seas. So we know that the area of immense population would have been around the Mesopotamian Valley, Europe as we know it today. And there's an interesting perspective that Stephen Bohr has said that I like. He says that the passage of and focus on the kingdoms seems to move from east to west as you go through the prophecies. So that in the beginning, Babylon was very much in modern-day Iraq. And by the way, the Pope Francis is visiting Iraq this week. And one of the things he said is that he wanted to visit some of the holy places. And as I read the news article, they were talking about Ur of the Chaldees and stuff, which is where Abraham was born, as being resident in Iraq. So Iraq, which is really the heart of the Mesopotamian Valley, modern-day Iraq, is really considered to be of strong significance to the Christian world, even though it is today predominantly a Muslim nation, right? And so it's interesting that Pope Francis is there, because he is attempting, as he said, to sort of give hope to the fledgling Christians who are in Iraq and assure them that they have the blessings of the Vatican and the church, etc., as they go by. So that's just a side issue. But I wanted to represent the fact that while Babylon started off there, eventually the powerful civilizations, the center of gravity of that area, moved from the Babylonian area, and it shifted a little bit more west into what is Europe, the Mediterranean basin, the Mediterranean Sea, Turkey. That is more east, if you will, more west, sorry, if you will, of Babylon and Iraq, right? And then as we get to the second beast, you realize we get even more west, because we head into America. So that is just giving you a sense, if you will, that the prophecies seem to be moving, if you will, in its radius, where it's moving from east to west. So we started off with Babylon in Mesopotamia to modern-day Iraq. We ended up with Rome, which is more around Italy and Turkey, which is west of Iraq. And then we move into America, which is even west of everybody else, right? That is why we refer to America as the West. So clearly, this first beast is coming out of the European space, if you will. It's a beast coming out of the sea, representing a beast coming out of a place where there's a lot of people. And we kind of said that if you compare that to Daniel chapter 7, then this beast must be the Roman nation. I think this is just review. We all know that, right? So the dragon giving the beast its power, its seat, and its authority. In a way, the dragon is used in this verse when we read that in the first few chapters of Revelation chapter 13. and we are told that the dragon was giving the beast its power, its seat, and its authority. The dragon used there is used interchangeably to represent Lucifer, or it's used to represent Rome. And maybe the best way to describe that is to say that civil Rome as a nation or governed under an emperor with governors and stuff, when they found themselves going through demise and destruction in the West, and they passed on the civil authority to the Roman Church in 538 AD. Justinian, the emperor, gave the Bishop of Rome civil power and stuff. You could argue it was civil Rome was granting to the church special powers, but ultimately one begins to appreciate that the real instigator, the real head of the orchestra, the leader of the whole movement is Lucifer himself. All right, and that is an important truth to refer to. When we talked about the 42-month period here, we are of course talking about the same 1260 years that is referred to in other parts of Daniel, some times and dividing of times, and then later on in earlier parts of Revelation. It's the same Dark Ages period which we studied in the seven seals and in the seven trumpets, etc. It's a period when the church, now imbued with political power, exercises a kind of dominance that is frightening to the point where they have martyred and sacrificed and tortured and killed, if you will, Christians who have remained true to the Bible and have refused to follow what the church says. And again, it is public knowledge. This is not just me saying it, or a particular religion saying it. It is a well accepted notion that the Christian world, the historical world, refers to this period as the Dark Ages. All right. The head of the beast being wounded is, we said, that is really dealing with the events that occurred in 1798 when General Berthier, as part of Napoleon's fleet, would have captured the Pope, and eventually he died in prison. And even though the church continued on after that, the church really had suffered a powerful wound. And so if that period was when the church was wounded with this sword, we want to suggest that when it says the wound will be healed, which is also covered in that first section, it seems to suggest that Rome, as a religious political entity, Rome as a Roman church, Rome led by a pope and a pontiff and a bishop of Rome, will have some kind of prominence and dominant world activity beyond 1798, which is really the period we are living in, because we are living downstream of 1798. And it suggests then that what we can expect from this prophecy is that there would be a healing, if you will. And if when the church was captured, that represented wounded, then we would assume that the church liberated, the church being free to move. I just by chance mentioned to you earlier that Pope Francis is in Iraq this week, right? And that in itself speaks to a healed religion, because it is interesting that the Iraqi authorities, even as they fight ISIS and their own terrorism, etc., are still making provisions to allow the head of the Roman Christian Church to come into their territory and be given head of state status. So that scepter, if you will, of a healed church, a healed Roman power is clearly demonstrated in our time as well, right? But then it talks about the fact that the whole world will marvel after the beast, and it will regain its prominent position in world affairs. Those are things that we think are yet to come. But what it does, though, is that when we looked at those first 10 verses of Revelation chapter 13, it clearly suggested that two classes of worshippers will emerge, because it says he will cause destruction to come upon those, upon the whole world, except for those whose names are written in the Lamb Book of Life. So clearly there would be two classes of worshippers: those who worship Christ, and then those who worship the beast with its heel wound, right? So there was also a little ending statement in verses 10 and 11 that kind of was warning, verses 9 and 10, sorry, that was warning the church that, you were fighting and killing people by the sword, but you too will suffer from the sword. And in truth, in fact, in 1790, that is exactly what happened. All right. But above all of that, the saints are encouraged to keep the faith. So that's a brief summary of what we had covered in the past 2 weeks when we had looked at the first beast. So I think you are clear. The first beast is coming out of the sea. It looks a lot like the beast we saw in Daniel chapter 7. So we have concluded very emphatically and authoritatively that it represents the little horn period of Daniel, which is the Roman church, the Roman Empire in the form of the church, because the Roman Empire had um, two incarnations, if you will. It was formed in two ways. It was the civil Rome, and then it was what I have been referring to as religious political Rome. It is what other writers refer to as pagan Rome versus papal Rome. I just prefer to say civil Rome, because civil gives us the connotation that they were ruling, they were controlling, and they were really not pagan in their orientation, because Constantine would have given the Christian church um, a lot of a lot of legitimacy during that period. But of course, because they practiced syncretism and they were pulling in beliefs from some of the pagan religions, they have been generally referred to as pagan Rome. But it was a legitimate, bona fide political organization that ran the Roman Empire with a strong thumb. But by 476, they were basically overrun by the barbarian tribes around them. And by 538, as the kingdom shifted more to the east, Turkey, into Constantinople, etc., you found that the Western Rome now became morphed, if you will, into the Church of Rome, which is headed by the Bishop of Rome, which is the Pope. All right, so that is our understanding that the first BCCs coming out of the sea is the Roman Church, the Roman Catholic Church, headed by its bishop, who has political and religious power, quite frankly, and that at some point in time it will be wounded. We know that in 1798. But what is the big takeaway from this first section is that it seems to be suggesting to us, yet to be clarified, but we'll deal with that. It seems to be suggesting to us that even though the church or the kingdom of Rome in its church form is wounded in 1798, subsequent to that, it will resurrect, it will become powerful again, and it will influence world affairs as we go forward, right? So that to me is extremely important. All right, great. So one of the panelists, one of the attendees just let me know they're on YouTube, and that's fine. So let's go now to the beast from the land, right? So let's go over what we saw. So we want to make a note of the fact that we are talking about land versus sea. I think we have established. So let me just deal with that. If we said that sea represents a place where there is a lot of people, obviously land represents a place where there is not a lot of people. So we begin to have a clue immediately and suggest that if he sees a beast coming out of the land, then unlike the kingdoms that emerged out of that Roman era and that area, this seems to be a kingdom now that is emerging, if you will, from the western side of the world, which is America, which was considered to be a place that was not well inhabited because, of course, the European world kind of showed disdain to the natives who were there, and they just assumed that if they were not Europeans, they weren't really inhabited. But the fact is that the area was sparsely inhabited because America is a huge place. And up until then, there was not a lot of population density as was happening in the case of Europe and in Asia, where you had in the Babylon and the Mesopotamian Valley. So clearly what is suggesting is that he sees a beast who comes out, a kingdom, if you will, who comes out of the sea, which we said is Rome, and we said it is Rome in its religious political form. And what we are now experiencing is a kingdom that emerges out of the land. And I am suggesting to you that that area is the United States of America. And we'll come to that. We talk about it in a little bit. You'll see me why it can't be Canada if we're talking West, or why it can't be South America. let's go through it and we begin to understand what we're talking about, right? So this is just to remind us of our bearings, and we are into this second part here. So let's just go over the verses that you begin to appreciate, verses 11 to 13. It becomes fresh in our mind. It says, I beheld another beast coming up. We'll talk about that, coming up out of the earth. So it is springing up. That was what coming up in its carnation there means. When they use that word there in its incarnation, it means springing up. So he sees another, and if beast really means kingdom, it means he sees another kingdom coming up out of the earth. And he's making a distinction by putting in earth there to say it is not coming up out of the sea, meaning that it is not emerging from the same place. After the Roman Empire crash, of course, the French Revolution and secularism blossom, and people will argue that modern day Europe grew out of that. So this is not Spain or Germany or England or Belgium or Switzerland or something. This is not that, because they are still areas that have come up, if you will, from where there are people in the sea. Must be an area that is not as populated, and I'm saying to you that it is the West America. So America is featured in prophecy, and this is its entry into the prophetic writings. And the fact that it talks about coming up suggests this is synonymous to what is used when you talk about germination and plants growing out of the ground. So it's almost to suggest that this is a nation that is being born, and we know that America gained their independence in 1776, which is around this, not too far away from 1798. So around the time that the Roman Empire is descending and going through a period where it is wounded, we have another nation, another kingdom emerging. Is America a kingdom? Not in the sense of traditional European kingdoms. America doesn't have a king, and it's not ruled with by a monarch and ruled by bloodlines, etc. It is a democracy. It's a powerful democracy. But there is no doubt that America has strong world significance, and America is seen sometimes as a policeman of the world, right? So clearly America has huge power. And what we also know, let me just deal with this one time because we come back to it, is that the people who fled to America to make up that nation in its early days, and they observed Thanksgiving in November and stuff because of that, were what is called the Pilgrims. And they were really Puritan Christians. They were Christians who believed in the Bible and felt that the Church of Rome was going wrong during the Dark Ages period. And fueled by the Reformation and fueled by Protestantism, they fled Europe, crossed the Atlantic, and ended up in America. And it is there that they gave thanks for reaching, etc. And basically, you can argue that the dominant religion of America is Protestantism. So whether it is the Anabaptists, whether it is Methodists, whether it is other evangelical Christians, whatever, the fact is that that Protestantism, which came out of the Reformation, which is really to say we are not following the traditional Christian route of a priest and a pope and a pontiff, that gained its prominence in America once America would have established itself as a permanent nation in 1776. And so the rise of Protestantism blossomed during that period. And many churches could claim, many Protestant churches, including the Adventist Church and others, can claim their origins in the United States of America post 1776. Is everybody okay with that? Some, of course, can claim that they were like Wesley and stuff, the Methodists would have had origins in other places, but the churches blossomed in America. And so over the years, we've had some powerful Protestant leaders and preachers in America, Billy Graham, T.D. Jakes, one could argue, and others who have been, Oral Roberts and Pat Robertson and others, who have been powerful speakers, and so Rick Warren now is one of those as well. There have been powerful Protestant speakers who have come forward, and America has always been seen as the home of Protestant religion, while Europe and Italy in particular has been seen as the home of Catholicism and the old world kind of thing going forward. So that is just some realities that we need to just lay down and put on. Now, This beast, like the others before, has horns. Now, in the past, in Daniel chapter 7, and even chapter 8 and 9, when he discussed the horns, there was not a lot of description about the horns, except for the case where in Daniel he talked about a little horn that grew up from the others. But he just simply called them horns. He didn't try to describe the horns. In this case, however, he describes the horns of that nation by saying that it is a nation, a beast that is coming out of the earth, springing up, growing up from the earth, and it has two horns like a lamb. So let's just stop there. The lamb, once you use that word lamb in prophecy and in the Bible in particular, you know that you are making a reference to Jesus Christ. Behold, the Lamb of God, John the Baptist says, who will take away the sins of the earth. As a matter of fact, John himself will refer to Jesus as a Lamb of God who would be able to open the seals in Revelation chapter 5. We talked about that before. So clearly, there is a very strong call out here where John is suggesting these few lines in this verse are so powerful that I could spend whole day here, right? Because basically what he's saying is that a nation, because that's what beast means, a nation emerges, comes up out of an area of earth as opposed to sea. So it is more west compared to Europe. I mean, saying that that is America. And indeed, America, after its protests and rebellion against the British by 1776, had become an independent nation, which is again around the time of Rome's um, um, fallen away to the point where by 1778 the Roman Church is wounded and is struggling to survive, right? But by this time, America is blossoming and becoming a very powerful nation. So this is how the scripture captures that period and that emergence. But more importantly, it says that America has two horns, and the horns are like a lamb. So it's almost suggesting that the nation that emerges on the earth is a nation that is this Jesus-like. Let me use that word. It is Jesus-like. Now, is that the reality? Of course it is. Because in those early years, those pilgrim fathers, as they are being called in America, they laid down some very powerful principles. They basically says there will be freedom of religion. You could worship whatever and whoever you want. There should be no persecution. That they will always seek to be thankful. They'll always seek to be helpful. I mean, we could argue whether or not they fulfill their ideals in terms of how they treated Native Americans and how they treated minorities, etc. But the fact is, on its official documents, constitution, its Declaration of Independence, etc., America espouses values that are very much godlike, very much Christ-like. You know, people, everybody's equal. Holy truths to be self-evident, all these kind of things, and they also included God in their Declaration of Independence. So there's a strong correlation to suggest that if you were an alien looking in, you would say, wow, this nation at that point in time certainly is a nation of peace and prominence and privilege, and certainly reflects something that is completely different to what they left on the eastern side of the Atlantic when you had the church persecuting people. They were saying that will not happen here. But then he doesn't stop there. He very quickly comes and says, and he spake as a dragon. Now that is a worrying thing. We are not yet at this stage in our elaboration of the chapter. We are not yet to explain that, but we are saying that while we can explain the lamb-like look, it seems to be suggesting that while the nation at first starts off as being lamb-like, and at first starts off as being godlike, and at first starts off as promoting real good ideals, it seems to be suggesting that at some stage it will behave like the dragon. Now, when we use the word dragon here, this is another example of where the word is used interchangeably. So it could certainly refer to Rome, and you could say, well, civil Rome, which was the dragon in the first part of the chapter that gave its power to the beast of the sea, which was religious Rome. Civil Rome was very dominant. It was very sounding nice about religion through Constantine, but it included a lot of false doctrines and it persecuted the saints, etc. Is that what it means when it says it speaks like the dragon? And then you begin to appreciate as well that you're suggesting, what John is suggesting here in this vision is that while the nation America stands up and looks and speaks the right things, some or the other, it is being influenced, it is being orchestrated, it is being vicariously managed, if you will, by Lucifer himself. And we begin to ask ourselves why and towards what end. And that is what we now need to figure out and ask ourselves, to what end? What is the value of a nation like America speaking as a dragon? All right. I hope that little synopsis is sticking very clear in your head at this point in time. All right. So we talked about the two horns. And then the next verse says, and he exercises all the power of the first beast before him. Now, the first beast before him was the one coming out of the sea, which was the Roman nation, but civil, religious, political Rome. So the power of that beast is one that persecuted true Christians and had people who really wanted to worship God hiding in rocks and mountains. Is that what will happen to America? That seems to be kind of strange. But then last year, we heard all kind of stuff about people being shot by police and all that kind of thing in the same place that everybody was supposed to be free and live nice and stuff. So we're going to see some cracks, if you will, in our perceptions of the United States, and begin to say, well, maybe this view that they are not what they say is maybe there is some merit in it, because we are seeing it in other aspects of civil society. All right. So it is basically saying that this beast that emerges out of the sea will begin to exercise all, that is a powerful word, all the power of the first beast before him, and that he will cause the earth and them that dwell therein to worship the first beast whose deadly wound was healed. If you just stop at this verse alone, you begin to appreciate why we said he speaks as a dragon, because it seems to be suggesting that somebody other the United States, subsequent to 1798, will in some way or the other facilitate a healing of the Roman Catholic Church to the point that it begins world prominence all over again, and it will some or the other cause people to worship that beast. Now, that beast is the Roman Church and its power. So, will Protestantism, which has its heart and soul in America, in some way or the other facilitate the growth and the worship of the Roman Catholic Church? That is something that is a question that we must have to try to figure out, but it certainly raises that question the way this language is put out, right? And then he also goes on to say, and he, meaning that same beast, which is the second beast, and which I've said to you now represents America, he doeth great wonders, so that he maketh fire come down from heaven. I think that is figurative language. It's not literal. Don't say because America shoot rockets up in the air and stuff, that is fire come down from heaven. No. This is figurative. We come back to that. That is the story of Elijah here on the earth in the sight of men. All right. So we need to appreciate that. So we have now woken up our appetite. Clearly, we have some stuff to deal with, and I'm run through these slides because we looked at them last week. But we want to understand, who is this second beast. I already been saying to you it's America, but let's see what is my support for that beyond what I just said to you, right? The first clue is that it will arise at the correct time, right? It says, he who leads into captivity, that is what we ended Revelation chapter 13, verse 10, shall go into captivity. And he who kills with the sword must be killed with the sword. That was what the narrative of the first beast, it ended with those words, right? And we know then that at 1798, the Roman church really went into captivity. That is what the word had said. And it really was wounded. The sword, you know, the general in those days, the most potent weapon in their arsenal was the sword. And they used the sword, if you will, to capture the Pope and to carry him into prison, etc. So the church used this sword to destroy people and hunt them down. The same sword, well, I mean, not the exact same sword, but the same sword of an army was used now to capture the church and throw it into prison. So it seemed to be suggesting, if we go back to the first clue, that this second beast is arising around the time of 1798. And I already told you that by 1776, America had gained its independence and was now very much on its march towards becoming a powerful industrial nation and a nation of strong economic importance and world importance. All right. So everybody okay with that first clue? The first clue is that we expect it to come around the time when the first beast goes into captivity and the first beast is captured. So the 1776, the 1798 gives us our first clue. The second clue says it arose in the correct place. Let's talk about that. Verse 11, which we just read, says, Then I saw another beast coming up out of the earth, and he had two horns like a lamb, and he spoke like a dragon. So you compare that, if you will, to the first one, and the first one said, I stood on the sand of the sea, and I saw a beast coming up out of the sea. So we've talked about that extensively, and we said that the first beast came out of the sea, the second one came out of the earth. So these are our supporting texts, right? Revelation 17:15 says, The waters which you saw were the harlot, where the harlot sits, are people, multitudes, and nations. So clearly coming out of the sea means coming out of a populated area and an area of high population density, which is Western Europe, Mediterranean Sea, Turkey, etc., right? Which is where Rome, the Catholic Church would have gained its prominence by becoming the de facto head of state of Western Rome by 538 AD. It therefore means that the second beast coming out of the sea. So basically the conclusion is, if the seas represent a populated area, then the earth must represent a relatively unpopulated area. And we clearly appreciate that by 1776, when America gains its independence, it is not a hugely populated place. Yes, the eastern seaboard, New England and Boston and stuff, there are a lot of people there, but you have a few people already making the trek towards the west and going across this far country and realizing that there's a huge span of land and acreage in the middle. So not only is the beast coming up around the right time, but it's coming up from the right place, right? Because it is, America is the one that came up out of the area of not heavy population. It would be a new nation, because what he says is, I saw another beast. In other words, he is looking at the first beast, which is Rome, but then he sees another one, and this is the one that is coming up. And I told you that that word coming up means springing up. It is almost germination. It is almost in its embryonic stage, emerging as a child. So this is the nation that is coming up at this point in time, and this is consistent, if you will, with what we saw when we talked about the progression of nations, and we got to Rome. This one is clearly coming up after that, right, which is 1776. It will rise rapidly. There is no doubt that America became a powerful nation very quickly, and that is what that word coming up means, right? So there's a slide on it here. It says coming up means springing up rapidly. So that he's deliberately using that word coming up, which is characteristic of America emerging as a powerful nation. It would be a democracy, because that is kind of what the horns like a lamb means. It is not a monarchy of persecuting people and stuff. It is really meant to give freedom and allow people to choose and to live freely. And America is seen as a place of where dreams are realized, right? So unlike the others that had 7 horns and 10 horns and 10 crowns, and the crowns represent monarchies and stuff, this one, there's no mention of crowns on the head. It is simply a reflection of the fact that it has 2 horns like a lamb. All right, so that's a clue. Did have a worldwide influence? Well, that one, we picked that up from looking at verse 12, right? He exercised all the power of the first beast before him, and he caused the earth and them that dwell therein to worship the first beast. So I don't know about the worship the first beast part yet, but there is no doubt that America has power over the whole earth. I mean, they have an influence that is really spread far and wide. So in summary, we can say that the first beast will come up out of the earth, an unpopulated area. It looks like a lamb but speaks like a dragon. It's a peaceful nation at the beginning but then it acts with some violence or with some intent or with some um, some deception later on. It gives authority after, it is given authority, sorry, after the deadly wound of the first beast, and it still has the authority after being healed, right? And then it performs great signs. So we need to talk about that. And we're saying that the only nation that matches this description is the United States of America. I mean, it just fits. It fits in a very powerful way to what we have been discovering, all right? So in terms of the identity of the beast, we are identifying America in prophecy here. And this is where America makes its entry into all of this prophecy that is so far very much focused on the old world in Europe and in Asia. But now we are making a jump across the Atlantic and we're including America into prophetic writings. And then if America is the lamb-like beast, then we need to pay attention to what verse 12 said. And it kind of now calls for us to be real concerned about what this means. He exercises all the authority of the first beast in his presence and causes the earth and those who dwell in it to worship the first beast whose deadly wound was healed, right? So it will change its character from a lamb to a dragon. So clearly, we have concluded this section by understanding the first beast represents America, but we are left with a worrying concern about its ending activities, but because it seems to channel, it seems to become almost, if you will, an agent of the first beast, which is Rome. Now that seems unlikely, but I want you to don't worry too much because some years ago it seemed unlikely that Germany would be referred to as one nation. When I grew up as a young man, it was normal when you watch the Olympics to watch West Germany. And when you watch soccer, you watch the West Germans with Beckenbauer and stuff playing football, and they were like real generals and stuff. But the East Germans were a whole different kettle of fish because they were the real they were like machines and robots. They were part of the Soviet machinery in those days. And then after the Berlin Wall was broken down, nobody talks about Germany today as East and West. I mean, some of the young people, you tell them about East and West Germany, they ask what you're talking about. So things that you didn't think could happen have happened, all right? So it's important to realize that while this speaks to a time when it seems as if America will somehow or the other, and I want to say Protestantism in America, because if you use a religious connotation, then you know that America, if Rome is the home of Roman Catholicism, then America is the home and headquarters of Protestantism, right? That is where everybody fled to. That is where most of the Protestant churches have their head and where they operate, etc. So that it seems to be suggesting that Protestantism will in some way unite, facilitate, create, allow for the further healing, resurrection of the first beast, and that the first beast will regain its prominence in the world. But we saw that when we discuss verses 1 to 10 before. So this is reinforcing that not only will its wound be healed, but its wound will be healed and facilitated by Protestantism in America or by America itself. And that leaves us with a lot of questions to answer, but it also hopefully awakens your interest because we now really need to pay attention to why does America begin first as a lamb, but then takes on dragon-like postures, which we need to understand. Now, still sticking with just these three verses, we need to remember the activities, right? In addition, he says, exercising the power, he also says, he doeth great wonders, so that he maketh fire come down from heaven on the earth in the sight of men. So I said, well, before we do that, let's just remember Elijah and Mount Carmel. Now, there is a video, but I don't want to show it. I want to go on to the other slides. And let's talk about this a little bit, right? So Elijah is occurring, I hope you can see these slides. Elijah is occurring at a time when Israel is ruled by a king called Ahab, and his wife is a Canaanite high priestess. So she is a person of a religious leadership, but from a pagan religion to Judaism. So he is the political head, She is a religious head of an alternative religion, but she influences, if you will, the politics. There is a union of church and state, if I could use that term here. And at that time, they are ruling Israel, right? They have really so the next slide says, the next point says, they have corrupted true religion in Israel. So the people are now worshiping idols, they're worshiping Baal, who's a sun god, they're worshiping a whole lot of gods, they have broken down the temples of God, etc., and Judea, etc. And it's in that context that Elijah is called to be a prophet, right? So he is a prophet of God. He is seeing what is happening in Jerusalem and the drama. And then he predicts to the people, to the king, he comes to the king and he says, there'll be a drought on this land for about 3.5 years. In the book of James, we are told it was for 3.5 years. So there's a drought in the land. And I said to you last week, a drought in the land is akin to climate change, right? Because so there's climate change. I have to say that because I find there are so many parallels between that period and maybe our period today, right? So clearly there is a period, it seems, where the political leadership is influenced by a false religion to the point where it corrupts the true beliefs of the people of Israel in observing their true God, Yahweh, Jehovah. And the prophet Elijah comes to tell them that they're wrong. But Jezebel, who is the wife of Ahab, she attempts to kill Elijah and destroy him, right? So they have a big contest, if you will, to prove who is the true God up at Mount Carmel. And I told you that story last week, right? But you could go back and read it in 1 Kings chapter 18. They gathered at Mount Carmel, 450 of Baal's prophets, and they tried to call down their God to consume the sacrifice. That was the pact that they made with Elijah. Whoever God consumes the sacrifice is the true God. That nothing happens. Nothing happens. If you read that story, there's some humor in that story. They march for almost the whole day, and Elijah is peacocking and giving them old talk and say, maybe your God is asleep, or maybe he went out for the day, he come back a little bit later. But when they're finished, Elijah, after they've poured water on the sacrifice, etc., Elijah prays to God and asks for God to be known as the most powerful God. And fire comes down from heaven and destroys the sacrifice, burns it up, consumes it. And that proves that God, the God of Elijah, is the true God of heaven and not the God of Baal. So that was a powerful demonstration of who's in power. So you begin to realize that in the Old Testament, fire coming down from heaven is associated with a means of proving the true God of heaven. Just think about that for a little bit, right? That this is a representation that this is the true God of heaven. All right. Of course, once that happened and the prophet wanted to be, Jezebel wanted to destroy the prophet, he fled to the wilderness. Wilderness, that song similar to what we read in Daniel in Revelation chapter 12. And he's fed by God, right? So God looks after him. And then God saves the remnant. When Elijah thought he was the only one who was saved, God said, no. There are about 7,000 people who have not bowed down to Baal, and they form my church and my people going forward. So there's a remnant who God saves. So just keep that in mind. Go back and read 1 Kings chapter 18. I want you to pay attention to this quote that comes from Stefanovic in his book, Plain Revelation. He says, while the first beast had a terrifying appearance, the second beast, in contrast, had a harmless appearance. I talked about the lamb-like look of America, right? It is lamb-like. On its head, there are two lamb-like horns, in contrast to the sea beast that has 10 monstrous horns. The lamb in Revelation is an exclusive symbol of Christ. This shows that the end-time power has a Christ-like appearance and is friendly to God's people. And this one resonates with us because we agreed that America was the place that the destination, if you will, of the Pilgrims as they crossed the Atlantic to escape, if you will, from the persecution that was going on in Europe, during the Dark Ages period. Then I wanted to remember that Jesus in Matthew chapter 24 and also now in Luke chapter 21, as he sat upon the Mount of Olives before his crucifixion, and he speaks to his disciples. This is when he talks about wars and rumors of wars and famines and pestilences, and the end is not yet, and that sort of thing. He made some powerful statements. He says to them, nations shall rise against nations, kingdom against kingdom, and there will be great earthquakes in many places and famines and pestilences. And then he says there will be fearful sights and great signs from heaven. Now that is powerful, because Jesus is warning his disciples that towards the end of time, a lot of times when we read these texts, even preachers, they go on the pulpit and they frighten the congregation by talking about wars and rumors of wars, famine, and pestilences. But we must remember this as well. Jesus said that there will be great signs from heaven. It's almost as if to suggest that people will be doing certain things that will look as if it's coming from God himself. Now remember that, because what we then heard him said in Isaiah is that to the law and the testimony, if they don't speak according to this word, it's because there is no truth in them. In other words, Jesus is saying, God is saying to us that when you experience miraculous events, don't use miraculous events as an indication of heaven's sanction. The real sanction is that the person who exposes miraculous events, who carries out miraculous events, who manifests the miraculous events, must also be aligned to what God says and teaches. So if you have somebody who says, I can heal you from sickness, but I will offer you up as I need to offer up a member of your family as human sacrifice, as a way of appeasing God to get you well. Something is wrong with that, because the law says thou shalt not kill. So something is wrong with that alignment. I begin to understand that. And if they said to you, well, you could have a car just like your neighbor own, and it will be bigger and better if you just pay me some money. That can't be right, because they're asking you to covet. I'm using these simple things, right? So I'm saying that is also important. Now, there's another point I want to make as I kind of bring some conclusion to this. Paul, in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 9 and 10, he says that Satan's end time activities will be accomplished by all sorts of power and signs and false wonders, and with all the deceptions and wickedness for those who perish. So the New Testament writers are certainly, and Jesus are certainly pointing to the fact that miraculous events in the end of time before Christ comes will happen, and they may not necessarily happen from Christ's side, but will happen from Lucifer's side. In case you're not too sure about that, let's go back to what we saw in Matthew chapter 24, verses 23 to 27. Same says, he says, at that time, if everyone says to you, look, here is the Messiah, or there he is, do not believe it. In other words, we will reach to a point where people will claim to be the Messiahs. Now, that is not future. To a large extent, some of that has started to happen already. There are people who have set dates and claim that they're Messiah. Some years ago in Guyana, before all of this oil revenue that Guyana is now enjoying, we had Jim Jones, who led, I have to say, 900 plus people to drink cyanide in Kool-Aid and commit suicide in a cultish feat. We had the David Koresh issue in Texas some years ago. We've had people around the world. One could argue that Adolf Hitler thought that he was a messiah for the Aryan race in Germany, and therefore led them into some kind of war and eventually destruction. So Jesus was saying that there would be, but I think he was talking less about Hitler and less about Jim Jones, and more specifically about the fact that he come towards the end of time. One of the deceptions that will emerge in the world is this view that God has come and that there's a false Messiah. And then he says, I said, I let it out of the bag, right? He says, for false messiahs and false prophets will appear and perform great signs and wonders to deceive, if possible, even the very elect. See, I have told you ahead of time. If anyone tells you, there he is out in the wilderness, do not go out. Or here he is in the inner rooms, do not believe it. For as lightning cometh from the east, even from the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. So this is an important clarification, because Jesus is saying that some people may say, I have come, but I'm in a certain country. Come and see me. And he's saying, my coming is going to be so spectacular that I don't care where you are in the earth, you will see it. And that's important. Now, why am I giving you all of this background story? Because that verse said to us, let's go back to it again. That verse said to us, and he doeth, verse 13, and he doeth great wonders. This is his second beast. And he doeth great wonders that he maketh fire to come down from heaven unto the earth in the sight of men. And I told you, fire coming down from heaven is in Elijah context a illustration or a manifestation that God is behind this and he is present, right? So Jesus is saying, John is telling us here that the second beast will facilitate, if not do himself, very important signs that will make you think he is from God, but he is not from God. That is the powerful takeaway from all of this, that a certain amount of deception is going to be taking place. And I say that that is consistent with the Elijah story, and it's consistent with what Jesus told us on the mount, which is what we talked about. So in summary, the verse is saying that the dragon gave authority to the beast from the sea. The same authority is used by the second beast. This is why he speaks like a dragon. So that the dragon, in this case being Lucifer, gave authority to the first beast, and he also gave authority to the church, and he also speaks like a dragon. So that the USA, which is always heard and consulted in global affairs, etc., is almost like a power in this period, and then more importantly suggesting that Protestantism, apostate Protestantism, and by that it means Protestantism that seems to give up on its original values and its thinking, will perform miracles pretending to be acting according to God's will. And this will shake consciences and lead people to accept the authority of the first beast, the Church of Rome. So this is a view of the future and things to come. This is when the book really becomes prophetic. And as you infer from this, and you use your historicism approach, you're saying that some things have happened. 1798 has already happened. The wound being healed is happening right now. America is in prominence right now, still talking a bit like a lamb, but there's some dragonish coming out in it. And then we are experiencing a bit of climate change and stuff, almost like Elijah's time. And it is suggesting that there is going to be some sort of alignment coming together, if you will, of the Protestant church that is basically headquartered, working out of America, that will allow it to align with the original Church of Rome, the Roman Catholic Church, and present the Roman Church as a leadership position and a powerful world position that must be challenged. Everybody okay with that? And that is kind of the important points that we need to note about that. Now, there's a lot more to be said about this when we start to talk about the image of the beast and the mark of the beast. But for now, I just want to stop at verses 13 and appreciate where we are. I also want to go back a bit to what we did when we looked at escape from the fiery furnace, because I think that is going to become extremely important when we get to the image of the beast. There's some important things. We know that Nebuchadnezzar required proof from his government officials of their loyalty, and so they were asked to worship the golden statue. Remember that? Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego didn't do it. So Nebuchadnezzar moved from a pure king who really recognized the God of Daniel to where he became, through hubris and arrogance, etc., to where he thought he should live forever, and his image should be worshipped, and that if he didn't do it, he'd be thrown into the fiery furnace, right? So that's how he became. And then we remember that he built this image, and I told you sometimes it is not necessarily a man, but it was an image. And look what the verse said, right? And we talked about that. We said he followed a sexagesimal system, right? So he used unit 60 for his measurement. We use up to 100 and then we start over 100 and 102. In the case of the Babylonians, they used 60. When they got to 60, when they got after 60, they started back to count from 1 until 59 again, right? So the number system in Babylon was a sexagesimal system, which is basically based on the number 60. Remember that. Remember that, because when we get later on in this chapter and you start to hear about 666, you're going to be looking for marks on people's heads. But I want you to remember that the Babylonian system of numbering was one that was based on 60, and that when he built this image to be worshipped, it was 60 cubits and 6 cubits, right? So you're beginning to appreciate that the sexagesimal approach to numbering is a number system that is based on the Babylonians, and you can argue it is a man-made numbering system as opposed to God's numbering system, which was based on 7, which he established in the Garden of Eden when he took 6 days to make earth and he rested on the 7th day. Appreciate that here is a numbering system God instituted that was cycled around the number 7, and here is a system that man institutes through the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar and his Chaldean engineers and astrologers, etc. And they have adopted a number system based on 60. All right. So Babylon has always been an opposition to God. When God destroyed the Tower of Babel, it was because they wanted to be like God and get to God. And we talked about Nimrod having founded Babylon, and he wanted it to be a long-lasting kingdom, etc. All right? Bear all of that in mind, because that has a lot to do with how we interpret 666 and all the old talk that has flowed in the public domain in the past with omen and people looking for stamp on your head. And if you get a phone call and the number look like it come from 666, you don't want it. If they give you a car and it says 666, you feel it's a bad sign and stuff. We ain't too sure about all of that. What we really wanted to understand is when it talks about the number of a man and it says 666, maybe it's saying that it belongs to a system of religion that is opposed to God. But I'll come to that when we deal with that number system next week. So I reminded you that there was an atmosphere of worship. We talked about earlier when we looked at the first beast, that what will emerge in the last days would be a question of who deserves worship. Are you going to worship God of heaven, the Lamb of God, and your name written in the Lamb Book of Life? Or are you going to worship a man-made system of religion, which is what happened in the Dark Ages period? It seems as if it happened in Daniel's time. It happened again in Rome, and one senses that it will happen again towards the end of time as we approach the second coming of Jesus Christ. So they went through the temptation of fire, but it's important to note that when they went through the fire, they were liberated. Jesus joined them and they walked out of there alive. So even though they lived through a fiery period, they were not harmed and they were saved. That is an important truth to understand. When we talked about this then, we talked about the fact that Nebuchadnezzar was practicing revisionism. He was basically reversing what God said. And so we said that while God reveals secrets and he deserves praise and worship, God, he reveals an image made of multiple metals. Nebuchadnezzar built an image made only of gold. All right? God was trying to remind Daniel and Nebuchadnezzar that earthly kingdoms are temporary and God's kingdom is forever. On the contrary, Babylon was trying to say that God's kingdom, his kingdom, will last forever. All right? God doesn't force us to obey him. He wants us to obey him by conviction and by his love. While the other hand, Babylon demands and threatens people to worship them, right? Remember that. Because what we're seeing in the beast behaviors, the dragon behaviors, seem to be suggesting a sort of false religion. Following God is a sober decision, while in the case of Babylon, it was meant to be pressure and music and force, etc. God doesn't require a union of church and state for his believers. An important point to note is that God is able to rescue and to save. I know some of you don't like to see the snake pit here, but we know we have seen this before in the Garden of Eden, right? And at the end of the day, these guys are overcomers because they kept their faith in God. There are some Old Testament texts you want to remember. God is our refuge and our strength, our very help in time of trouble. All of these are reminders, if you will. Fear thou not, I am with thee. Be not dismayed, I am thy God, I will strengthen thee. Yea, I will help thee. Yea, I will uphold thee in thy right hand. When the saints of God may be living through the period being discussed here in the second beast, we need to remember that God is able to save. What are you all right with that? I think we're finishing right on time today. So in summary, I'm saying to you that the vision of Revelation chapter 13 is one where we are seeing two beasts, one emerging from the sea, one emerging from the land. The one that emerges from the sea is the Roman kingdom under the Pope as its leader, which is Western Rome after 538 AD all the way to 1798. In 1798, as the French Revolution and secularism ascended and the Pope was captured, he is the head of the nation and the head of the church at the same time. He's captured. The church has experienced a wound. The nation itself is already coming to an end, and Rome is no longer the powerful nation that it was. But around that time, another nation is starting up, is emerging, it's coming out. It is not from the old days, it is now emerging as a powerful nation. And that nation is the United States of America. It is occurring to the west of the eastern theater that is the Mediterranean Sea. And in that western area, it is across the Atlantic. The Puritan Christians, the ones who have been persecuted by the church, they have taken a journey, a treacherous journey, albeit, across the Atlantic, and they have landed on Plymouth Rock, and they have landed in America. They give thanks. They have established a whole new nation. It becomes powerful. It is a nation of freedom of religion. It's a nation of exposing equality of all mankind and things. It sounds nice. It sounds very lamb-like and Jesus in its approach. But you and I living in 2021 know that there has been a huge dichotomy, a huge discrepancy between what America says and what America does. And we have the experiences of the civil rights movement. We have the experiences of the Japanese during the period of World War II, when the Hiroshima bomb was dropped and so many of them were rounded up and put into jails and prisons. We have just last week, this week, we have had American basketball players of Asian origin claiming that they were called coronavirus while they were playing basketball because some people saw them as causing a virus. So notwithstanding the lofty virtues articulated in America's Constitution and its documents and independence documents, etc., and in its laws and statutes, the fact is, underneath that, there's always been a dichotomy where you find what is practiced may be different from what is preached. All right, and it seemed to be suggesting that span between what it says and what it does will continue to grow bigger, and it will, at one point at least, facilitate, allow for, be part of the healing of the wound of the Roman Church as it grows and becomes important. All right, so I have a question here. Let me just see that. I always have a problem understanding when people say that God does not force us to obey him, but a central theme of Christianity is that if we don't obey him, we will perish and will burn in hell when Christ comes. Isn't that forcing us to obey him? Yeah, so I suspect that is a concern. Let's go back to that slide if I can. Right, so it says here, God's children choose to obey him by beholding we become changed. So the fact is that this sin problem that has entered into the world has to be dealt with, right? That is fundamental. So what God has done is laid out, if you will, the choice. The choice is either you respond to the opportunity of salvation that has been presented in the cross of Calvary, or you continue as things are, which will lead to ultimate death. So it's like a car that is flawed and heading towards a cliff. You know that when it reaches the cliff, it will go over, but there's an opportunity to stop the car and come out. And if you can't stop, to jump out, maybe, right? If you choose to stay in the car and you end up over the cliff, then there's a choice that you have made. Now you can argue, which I suppose is the heart of the question, that in a way it is a psychological. There's a word they use for that, where you kind of say you are under duress. It's like a psychological duress, because you have the reality of hell looming, and therefore it means that if you don't do it, that you will end up in hell. But the key message here is that serving God to escape hell is not sustainable, because that has its own pitfalls and can lead to all kind of drama. The key message here is that people have to choose to serve God. Now remember that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego said to the king then, we are not even sure. We don't even know if our God will save us. That's what they said in Daniel chapter 3. We don't know that our God will save us, but we are choosing to serve him. So they took a conscious decision then that they will serve God even though they were going to face immediate burning and torture. And they went into the hellfire. So it wasn't as if they got away from it. So I'm saying that what really evolves is a choice. It is not meant to be duress. It is not meant to say, well, if you don't do this, that will happen. It is meant to do that in the sense of putting the two positions in front of us to say, this is the choice you have to make, right? Adam and Eve had a choice. So they were in the garden and they had to decide whether they were going to serve God by eating of the tree of life and continue to serve God, or they're going to serve Lucifer by eating of the other tree. And they made a choice. I don't think they appreciated that exactly what God said would have happened, but as it started to happen, and they were now put out of the garden, and they went through the drama of seeing animals dying and stuff, it became very clear that they had made a bad choice. And it looked then as all was lost. But then we are told that God said, no, 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 I will come and I will die in your place. And so the real value proposition here is not so much, if you don't do this, you will die, because that is our given. Everybody is going to die, and everybody is destined to experience the wages of sin, which is what Paul calls it. But the opportunity for eternal life is given by God, and it's a choice we now have to make. In the case of Nebuchadnezzar, what he was doing was basically saying very explicitly, bow down and worship me as opposed to God. And if you don't, I will destroy you. That was a whole different level of duress. That is a whole level of subjection and persecution that was coming about there. All right, so the question is it that the church is categorizing sin as big sin or little sin, where some sins are more tolerable to the congregation based on personal judgment and subjectivity? No, and the question is, sin for us is not about action as opposed to being, right? So David, for instance, says, I was born in sin and shaped in iniquity. So we begin to appreciate that salvation is not about so much what we do. What we do, and I oftentimes say that, is that we serve God because we are saved, not to be saved. So the challenge about trying to earn salvation by scoring points with God is not sustainable. It cannot work, because it eventually leads to frustration. What is required is to be experience conversion and the blood of Jesus Christ. Once Christ converts us and we become converted by him, which is really a choice that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego would make. And when we get to this end time situation of having to choose who to worship, if I could find Let me just go back to that slide. If we could find that slide um, in the conclusions. Right. So what we when we looked at the verses 8, I believe, of Revelation chapter 13, verse 8, what he then said is that the beast will force worship and that he will destroy all those except those whose names are written in the Lamb book of life. So what emerges then is two classes of worshippers. Why would I worship Christ? I will only worship Christ because I have gained salvation from him and he now means everything to me. And therefore I worship him. Even if it means I go through persecution, I will worship him. As opposed to those who will worship an alternative God, which is what Nebuchadnezzar created by putting that image upon the cross. All right, so the question is, all right, somebody's answering here, and they said we need to understand consequences in relation to obedience and disobedience. If you run the red light and get smashed and die, that doesn't mean that the law of God's love is forceful. However, when we obey, there are joys forevermore. When we do not, then we are automatically choose the wages of sin, which is death. Choices in our hands. So that's a response that came in. So the issue really becomes one of choice. What choice are we making? So I'm saying to you that death is a foregone conclusion. Hell is a foregone conclusion. That's why Psalms 51 is a powerful psalm. So David says, I was born in sin. That is a powerful statement by itself. And I was shaped in it. When he says born in sin, as a baby, nobody commits sin. But the fact is, we are born with sinful natures. That is our nature. So we become sinful. So you coming into the church is more of an end result rather than a beginning. The church is not meant to earn you salvation. The church is because you have been saved. So because we have come to Christ, we now congregate and we come together and we promote and we encourage the standard of living that God wants of us and the obedience he wants of us. But obedience comes once we have been converted from Jesus Christ. You cannot be obedient if you are not converted. I mean, that is just the fundamentals of the Christianity. And that is why when the rich young ruler came to Christ and he says, what should I do to be saved? Matthew chapter 19. And Jesus said to him, observe the Lord thy God with all thy heart, love him with all thy heart, and thy neighbor as thyself. And he says, I have done all those things. He said, what does the commandment says? He said, I've done all those things. And Jesus said to him, sell all that you have and give to the poor. And it sounded like a strange statement to the disciples because they knew that if you were rich and suffered because God had blessed you. So when Jesus was telling them that, it sounds strange. And interestingly, the Bible says, that is an interesting example. I remember I came across that this week. He said, Jesus loved him, but he walked away sorrowful because he owned a lot of possessions. He didn't want to give it up. So he made a choice not to accept what Christ was doing, and he could get more. Now, on the other hand, Jesus then gave another parable, and he says, a man knew that there was treasure in a field, and he sold everything he had to buy the treasure, to buy the field, because when he got the field, he got the treasure. In other words, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego knew that serving God was the ultimate salvation. And living for him and worshiping him was the ultimate salvation. And so it really is a question of choice as opposed to sin and the congregation of sin, etc. That is how the church is practiced, but that has very little to do with the reality of making a choice between continuing on the cliff with the car cleaning off the cliff or jumping out and accepting an opportunity to live a different life by choosing Jesus Christ, which is exactly what happened. You notice that in Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, when we did that lesson, it says it was on the plain of Dura. There were there were about 3,000-4,000 people there. Almost all of them were captives from Israel. So on that plain with over 3,000 plus people, only 3 guys stood up because everybody else chose to worship the image that Nebuchadnezzar had put up rather than worshiping the God of Jehovah, who they had learned about in back in those days. So let me just conclude. As in the days, this is my closing message. This is one we had used before. As in the days of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, so in the closing period, which is really what Revelation 13 is pushing, and it's giving a prophetic look ahead, right? It's saying, so in the closing periods of Earth's history, the Lord will work mightily on behalf of those who stand steadfastly for the right. He who walked with the Hebrew worthies, meaning the boys, the Hebrew boys, in a fiery furnace, will be with his followers wherever they are. Now, that's a bit ominous, right? Because it's suggesting that it's going to be a heady period, almost similar to what happened with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, as we move towards the end of time. There will be a period of persecution. That is where we get all the horror stories about the end time, right? Because it sounds as if as the forces of Lucifer and the forces of Christ come to a head, there would be a very clear and distinct battle to make people decide who they're going to serve in these last days, right? So we are living in a period of peace now, but it seems that that will not last forever. His abiding presence will comfort and sustain. So he's saying that when you get to that period, what really keeps us and keeps your faith and don't allow you to walk away when you're experiencing all this drama is our faith in Jesus Christ. His abiding presence will comfort and sustain in the midst of the time of trouble, which is what is expected. And that is not a careless phrase, because when we looked at Daniel chapter 12, we were told that phrase came up, right? Which he says, at the time of trouble, such as never was, Michael should stand up. We had looked at that when we looked at Daniel chapter 12. Such as never been since there was a nation. As he quote there. His chosen ones will stand and move. Chosen means not that he has chosen us. We're not talking fate here and predestination. We are saying chosen in the sense that people have chosen to serve God, right? Satan, with all the hosts of evil, cannot destroy the weakest of God's saints. Angels that excel in strength will protect them, because we saw that in Daniel chapter 10 and 11, where the angel of God was actually protecting Cyrus to allow the Israelites to go back into their homeland. And in their behalf, Jehovah will reveal himself as a God of gods, able to save to the uttermost those who put their trust in him. So we're really talking about trust. Are we willing to put our trust in God? And are we willing to allow him to guide us as we go through what will be some challenging times ahead? Next week, as we continue to focus on Revelation chapter 3, we have now completed the two beasts in terms of its identity and its activities. But we go a little bit more into the activities of the second beast. And we want to focus a lot more on the image of the beast, which is referred to in verses 14 all the way down to 16. And then as we go to 17 and 18, we'll talk about the mark of the beast as well. And we'll appreciate what is meant here. But keep in mind Elijah's story, keep in mind Nebuchadnezzar and the fiery furnace story, because I think, those two stories are the context in which that terminology is used about an image to the beast and a mark to the beast. If you grasp those two stories, you're ready to appreciate what is being presented to us in this section. All right. Any further questions? Anybody? Okay, great. I think we were able to complete on time today again. Can we try not to bite off more than we could chew in terms of the timing? So let's offer with a prayer as we close off today's session. Heavenly Father, we thank you for your word. We thank you for the message you continue to reveal to us. We thank you, Lord, that you have given us so much ample warning about these changing geopolitical events, that when they occur, we will be ready. We would not be disturbed. We will not be moved away from our moorings. And like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, we will serve you. Even if it means sometimes to our personal detriment, we will remain faithful to you. We pray that you would cement within our hearts the choice to serve you in spirit and in truth. and that we remain with you throughout the ceaseless ages of eternity, is our prayer in Jesus' most holy name. Amen.